Our guests today are a trio of heavy-hitting M&A practitioners: Ethan Klingsberg of Freshfields, Daniel Wolf of Kirkland and Ellis, and Alan Klein of Simpson Thacher. They're all up in New York City. This is part of our Doing Deals Hot Takes conference. This is about interim operating covenants. I'm Brock Romanek. Today on Zippy Point. Ethan, Daniel, Alan, thanks for being here. Interim Operating Covenants, IOCs. I'm going to kick it to you, Ethan. Thanks so much for putting the panel together. Heavy-hitting panel. Take it away.
Sure. So interim operating covenants is an area with lots of tension during negotiations these days, taking a lot of time. I think two driving factors I'd point to. One is due to lots of foreign investment, regulatory clearances, and antitrust clearances. We're having longer and longer periods between signing and closing. And then the second is, what the heck does it mean to do ordinary course when you're dealing with extraordinary circumstances? Does that mean you should stick to the ordinary course and not go extraordinary, or it'd only be ordinary to do something out of the ordinary? So, Daniel, Alan, how are you dealing with this mess?
Yeah. Well, look, I think, Ethan, I think you captured it well. It's very interesting. We had a bunch of clients that got caught up in disputes. I think this was one of the key areas of focus. I think, the MAE around the pandemic was largely settled. Sort of either you had a pandemic exception or it was covered by the general exceptions. And really the action in the deal disputes since COVID hit has been around the IOCs and buyers claiming that actions that sellers took in response to COVID was outside the ordinary course. It's interesting, you look at two different deal disputes that came up a few months apart. And in one of them, which was the Sycamore Victoria's Secret dispute, there the buyer argued that by responding too strongly to COVID, the seller was acting outside the ordinary course. And then a few months later, you had the Simon Taubman dispute. And the argument was you didn't respond strongly enough to COVID, so, like a seller's really caught there because, ordinary course. And, if you can be hit from both sides by the buyer, it's really, really a tight place to be. And I think that's why a lot of time is being spent in negotiations now about what exactly that means. I think we were all hoping that we get some guidance out of the court. When you have these deal disputes, the very least we as deal lawyers hope for is maybe at least a couple of these disputes reach the finish line, so we have some guidance for the next time it hits. Not that many did, but one in fact did. Was that MAPS Hotel case, and I think it gave a lot of guidance, really addressed that question about whether ordinary course means ordinary course. I think the way the judge articulated is it on a clear day, or is in the middle of a viral rainstorm? And, sort of how do you think about ordinary course under those circumstances? And I think, as you go through the decision, you get some real pointers on how to think about the words there are in those covenants. And I think that has some significant implications about how we're thinking about it and how negotiations of those are going since COVID.
So one of the interesting facts, Alan, is in the MAPS Hotels case, there was not a request for consent to act outside the ordinary course. And it's not uncommon for those types of consent provisions to say the consent's not to be unreasonably withheld. And in my experience, reading the case law not to be unreasonably withheld, most of it's about subletting apartments, right? There's not a lot of not to be unreasonably withheld case law talking about what it means in connection with ordinary course covenants. What's your tips on how to deal with that from an interpretive point of view, guiding clients? Should we be putting more language in agreements?
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's very interesting, right? Because the global pandemic exception to interim operating covenant had not yet been written when the pandemic started, and I think, if nothing else, both the disputes that arose and to the extent it ended up in a Delaware court have shown you have to ask for consent, and then if the consent isn't given for whatever reason, you have to make a choice as to whether that withholding is unreasonable, and you got to tell the buyer that, and then you got to do what you have to do to save your company. And because there are also reps saying that you're doing, you're doing what you have to do to run the business. So there are competing provisions even within an agreement about what steps a management needs to take when a disaster hits. I would say if an earthquake hit or the meteorite struck the factory, you'd have the same issues about trying to preserve the value of the business. The fact that there were clear steps, not necessarily terribly clear, but there were specific steps many companies took in the retail business and the hotel business to follow state or local regulations about shutting down, and B, going out and making sure they had the liquidity to survive. And it was those two areas, preserving the existence of the business, where if a seller had done nothing, they would have been subject to breaching a whole bunch of representations, frankly. So there was a kind of caught between a rock and a hard place aspect to this. And so I think taking a step back, there is a lesson to be learned here, which is, on the whole, these agreements and the deals that we all do are very seller friendly, right? If you think about what's gone on with material adverse effect clauses over the last 35 years, 40 years, everything that has happened has become an exception to an MAE clause. When the 87 crash took place, an exception came into all the MAE clauses saying, oh yeah, whatever bad things happen in financial markets are not going to be an MAE. When the 9/11 took place, terrorism became an exception to MAE. What hadn't happened in parallel with that was sort of the similar extension of those kinds of carve-outs to interim operating covenants, or to kind of rationalize having to address extraordinary situations that might arise and affect interim operating covenants, with also addressing the representation and warranties, and having to sort of carve all these extraordinary situations out of ending up, putting you in a position where you couldn't turn right and you couldn't turn left.
And Alan, it's interesting on the consent point. I think one of the interesting things that Ethan, you were alluding to in the case is that, the court said there's no such thing as deemed consent. Even though you had a not to unreasonably withheld qualifier, court said you can't say, well, I would have gotten consent had I asked, because you weren't allowed to unreasonably withhold. One of the real practical effects, we've definitely seen people at least trying to raise it on the sell side, with some successes. Now people are putting in provisions that say, if I ask and you don't respond within 2 days, or you don't respond within 3 days, you're deemed to have consented. Because I think one of the challenges that a lot of sellers found was they were sending these notices saying, I need to do, as Alan pointed out, I need to do something extraordinary. I need to draw down on my revolver. I need to close my stores. And buyers were just sitting on those notices. And, it's great to say not to be unreasonably withheld or delayed, but, are you really going to gamble your deal on saying, well, you didn't respond, you delayed, therefore I'm going to just go ahead? So a lot of people were stuck in this spot. So by forcing a response, by saying, if you don't respond within 24 hours, 48 hours, you're deemed to have consented, I think that's a direct, sort of result of the guidance from this case and some of the practical experience that we saw during COVID.
But still, I think we're leaving still huge gaps, because I think there's two issues. One is, it's very hard to say what unreasonably withheld means, because one thing, Alan, I agree with you. Yes, the objective is to preserve the business, but there's another objective, which is to be able to continue to get the deal done. And sometimes those two objectives are in tension. So for instance, drawing down on the revolver may screw up your ability to get your acquisition financing, while it may also, maybe it's a good thing or a prudent move for the business. It may not be in the best interest of executing. The second point is on bringing in the MAE exceptions. We're really not seeing that. I mean, if you go back, I think it was like 5 or 6 years, there was the Cooper Tire case, where a key part of that holding was, we really can haul in everything from the MAE definition into the ordinary course exceptions. And there was a lot of talk at that time saying, well, maybe we should haul in these exceptions and give at least more. And I've had this argument during negotiations where they say, well, let's make it clear that you can't unreasonably withhold consent due to extrinsic circumstances or the types of circumstances that give rise to an MAE. And, you know, then going back to last year's decision in MAPS Hotels, does a buyer really want to give that kind of flexibility, frankly? And then that's results. I don't think we've resolved this. I agree, Daniel, that you can't just, we're getting past the point where you could just fake it by saying, you know, punt on the issue. But I think we still have a lot of legislating left to do within our agreements to try and work this out.
Yeah, one of the conversations we've been having is about, you know, it's great. We've all now, it's almost standard fare to have the COVID exception, you know, COVID measures exception to the IOCs. Okay, but that's great. You know, I always analogize it to, you know, the fact that we're still taking our shoes off, you know, 14 years later because there was a shoe bomber. You know, it's like we're always fighting yesterday's battle. You know, that the real question, and I think you were alluding to it, was, you know, how are people thinking about the next COVID, right? Like, we can't put our head in the sand and say, and it's not going to be COVID. You know, it's going to be something else. And how do you think about IOCs in that regard? You know, I would say people have been talking about it a lot, but I haven't seen a ton of movement. I will say, and, you know, it's interesting you mentioned Cooper Tire, because that sort of, you know, just looking for interesting placement, I noticed the deal that was announced the other day for Goodyear announced that they were in fact buying it. And in that contract, for the first time in a, you know, sort of a major M&A deal that since COVID, I saw they had the COVID measures exception that applied, you know, sort of across the board. And then they had, you know, sort of what was kind of like the next COVID exception to the ordinary course covenant. So there was an attempt, like, you know, sort of, it was much narrower. It wasn't sort of like, hey, do whatever you want. But there definitely was an attempt to try to legislate for the next extenuating circumstance, you know, an extraordinary circumstance, and say, under those circumstances, you are allowed to depart from the general ordinary course covenant. It'll be interesting to see whether that gets traction, because, you know, the putting in the COVID measures, as I said, you know, kind of that's already at the tail end of relevance, and really now we have to start thinking about
it's somewhat cabined anyway. We're not talking about anything that's related to COVID. It's really, it's almost really of an extension of required by law.
Yeah,
Alan.
No, the Maginot line didn't really work either. So, you know, so I think it's entirely the right point to think about. Sure, you know, deal with a pandemic exception. God forbid there may be another one. Who knows? But more broadly, if you're, I would put it in the context. Overall, these agreements are very pro-seller, right, and have only gotten increasingly so over the years. And I think in the current environment right now, there's I think we're all seeing an uptick in activity. There are a lot of buyers and not enough targets going around. You know, if you're a thoughtful seller, how do you want to protect yourself in order to not get caught up if there's an extraordinary circumstance, so that you are able to take steps necessary to keep your business alive, regardless of whether the exact manner of doing that is, you know, what a buyer, you know, is in, you know, a buyer would prefer to see. One of the things we saw at the outset of the pandemic was the immediate reaction of a lot of buyers was to try to figure out if they could get out of pending deals. And again, that is not in the interest of a seller. And a buyer who wants to have an exit strategy if something extraordinary happens may not be the best buyer from a seller's perspective. So, you know, goodness knows, again, there's you know, what had been a financing out at one time for PE buyers has turned into a reverse termination fee. You know, you can go down the list of elements that have crept into deals that increasingly make them seller friendly. And I think, you know, this is yet another perspective on that.
Ethan, it might be worth highlighting, just, a couple of other drafting points if those,
Sure.
sort of are helpful coming out of the case. I mean, I think two pieces which, I wouldn't characterize them as surprising, but certainly were some of the first we've heard about it. I think we've always sort of viewed ordinary course consistent with past practice as probably being interchangeable. Hey, it's a little bit better for the buyer if it says consistent with past practice. I think Lasser in the case attributed a high degree of significance to consistent with past practice, and basically said that meant that you could only look at the seller's behavior and not the industry's behavior. And, sort of in light of, sort of a COVID-like situation, I think that's actually a material difference, right? About trying to say, hey, I'm only going to look at what I've done in the past, or I can look at what the whole industry has done in this past. The whole industry has probably had more exposure to more extenuating circumstances than you personally have had. So, there feels like there is a difference, and I'm certainly seeing people actually in drafting and negotiations attribute something to that. And then, the other one, I think there was some assertion. The covenant in that case just said you will operate in the ordinary course. Sort of a seller always tries to get, I will use reasonable best efforts to operate in their course, or commercially reasonable efforts. In that case, the seller tried to say there was an implied efforts covenant. Like, you couldn't possibly mean that I have to flat out operate in the ordinary course. It's implied. And I think the court came back and said, nice try, but you know what? If you wanted an efforts covenant, go look at the rest of your agreement. And the antitrust covenant says you will use reasonable best efforts to get approval. It doesn't say you will get approval. So there's no such thing as an implicit efforts qualifier. So I think, again, when you sit down now and negotiate, it's pretty hard to convince a seller that it would be appropriate to give that as a flat rep. And I certainly have been seeing, sort of with a much higher degree of consistency, an efforts qualifier being put on the ordinary course covenant, sort of somewhat as a direct output of, both all of the disputes, but like the very clear guidance from the court in this case.
Although I will say, there's also commentary, I guess you could say it's probably dicta, but in there about what reasonable best efforts means. And this flows into the antitrust covenants as well. There's not a lot of comfort that you get with these. First of all, he says, look, there's no real difference between commercially reasonable best efforts, all that reasonable efforts, and that's all a waste of hot air. And on top of that, you still have, the focus is on the objective of the covenant and acting in good faith to get to that objective. And you got to take steps that are going to help you get to that objective. Now, I guess the one difference is that there's something completely out of your control. So you're acting still in good faith to try and get to that objective. You're not going to get dinged, and which is particularly important given that I don't see any movement away from the lowercase m in all material respects bring down, nor do I see, as Alan was saying, anybody bringing in exceptions there the way you do for the MAE. But I think I think there's a widespread underestimation of the power of a reasonable best efforts covenant. It requires you to do quite a bit if you don't have the fetter on it. And I think the better solution, at least from a target's point of view, or maybe everybody's point of view, is just to spend a little bit more time thinking about what kinds of extrinsic circumstances, what kinds of other market industry sector behavior are we going to find reasonable to bring into the picture, whether it's in your interpretation of what reasonable consent means or reasonable best efforts means, but to give a little color on that. And I think actually, I probably will end up, maybe, as Alan says, helping sellers to some extent there, but I also think it will give parameters that end up benefiting both sides to some extent.
Keep in mind a couple of things. One is that the Delaware Court of Chancery is a court of equity, right? So they are trying to drive to an outcome that they in fact think is fair and appropriate, as opposed to necessarily being strictly a court of law. So you do wonder how that plays into this notion that there is an element of generally reasonableness or good faith when you evaluate all the actions in addition to the terms. The other element is I would think that we need to be more explicit that taking actions to comply with law are permitted under an interim operating covenant. Shutting down restaurants or hotels if there's a shutdown order, or clothing stores, ought not to be a breach from a seller's perspective.
Yeah, and Ethan, one other, one final point just to think about, one of the things that, certainly came out in a few of those disputes, and it's particularly true if you have a strategic buyer, but if you have a private equity buyer that's a regular player in the sector, I've definitely heard some sellers starting to say, it should be deemed to be reasonable if I react the same way you, the buyer, are reacting. So, if you have, if you have a retail company buying a retail company, it's kind of awkward to go into court and say, what you did was a reaction, even though I did the very same thing. But people did that unabashedly. People went to court and said, I don't care what I did, you're not permitted to do it. It'll be interesting to see again whether sellers, sort of in the context of all of these moving pieces, reasonable best efforts, consistent with past practice, not to be unreasonably withheld, at least make a stab at saying that it's not deemed to be unreasonable if it's consistent with what you, the buyer, do with respect to your own business. Because that, there's something a little bit offensive about, making that argument, but people did.
Well, but I don't, judges don't have to accept it.
Yeah.
Of course, MAPS Hotels is on appeal. So who knows? Maybe in a couple
We'll be
months
back in 6 months to talk about the Supreme Court that overturned everything we just said.
Yeah.
Oh, come on.
Yeah.
So I've been spending a lot of time on Clubhouse. I've been addicted in the sustainability and climate change rooms, and every plot line of every horrible thing that you could possibly think of for a horror movie seems to be happening. So there will be lots of black swans, perhaps every year. I don't know. I can't thank you enough, Daniel, Alan, and Ethan. It was awesome. And maybe we'll see you in 6 months.
All right,
Awesome.
cool.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, everybody. Be well.
Bye-bye.